June 22, 1941. 3:15 a.m. The eastern frontier of Europe erupts in fire. 3.5 million German soldiers cross into Soviet territory along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Nearly 2,000 miles of simultaneous invasion. This is Operation Barbarossa, the largest military operation ever launched, and it will consume more lives, destroy more cities, and reshape the world more profoundly than any other campaign in history. Before we dive into exactly how Hitler's seemingly unstoppable war machine ground to a halt in the frozen wastes of Russia, let me be clear about what you're getting here. No fluff. No dramatic reenactments pretending to be analysis. Just the decisions, the strategy, the geography, and the brutal mathematics of industrial warfare. This is the story of how Nazi Germany came within sight of Moscow, captured millions of Soviet soldiers, seized territory larger than Western Europe, and then watched it all disintegrate into catastrophic defeat. If this is the kind of history you're looking for, the real story, told completely, then hit that like button right now and drop a comment below. It helps more than you know. Now let's go back to that summer morning in 1941 and watch the Third Reich hurl itself into the abyss. Adolf Hitler had been planning this for over a year. Since the fall of France in June 1940, Germany had dominated Western Europe. Britain was isolated, bombed nightly but unconquered across the Channel. Hitler had achieved what his predecessors in World War I never could, total victory in the West. But the Führer was not satisfied. His entire ideology, laid out in Mein Kampf years before, centered on one obsessive goal: Lebensraum, living space in the East. The Soviet Union, in Hitler's twisted worldview, was both an existential threat, the heartland of Jewish Bolshevism, and a treasure house of resources. Ukraine's wheat fields, the Caucasus oil reserves, the industrial cities of Western Russia, all of it would fuel the 1,000-year Reich. And Stalin's Red Army, he believed, was a hollow force, decapitated by purges, incompetently led, equipped with inferior weapons. A swift campaign, 6 weeks perhaps, and the entire rotten structure would collapse. That was the theory. Here's what actually happened. On December 5, 1940, Hitler approved the final operational plans. The attack would be called Operation Barbarossa, named after the medieval German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, who had led crusades into the East. 3 massive army groups would strike simultaneously. Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, would drive through the Baltic states toward Leningrad. Army Group Center, under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, would punch through Belarus and drive straight for Moscow along the historic invasion route through Minsk and Smolensk. Army Group South, led by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, would sweep through Ukraine toward Kiev and the resource-rich lands beyond. Supporting them, 3,350 tanks, 7,400 artillery pieces, 2,770 aircraft. It was the most powerful offensive force ever assembled. The Germans had one strategic assumption baked into every level of planning: this had to be over before winter. Their intelligence estimated the Red Army could field perhaps 200 divisions. Destroy those in a series of massive encirclement battles, capture the key cities, and Soviet resistance would crumble before the autumn rains turned roads to mud. Nobody planned for a winter campaign because nobody believed it would last that long. At 3:15 a.m. on June 22, the artillery opened fire. Across the entire front, German guns pounded Soviet positions. 15 minutes later, the Luftwaffe struck Soviet airfields, catching hundreds of aircraft on the ground. By noon on the first day, the Soviet Air Force had lost over 1,200 planes, most destroyed before they ever took off. German armored spearheads punched through the frontier defenses. The Soviets had concentrated massive forces near the border, a disastrous decision born from Stalin's paranoid insistence that any retreat was treasonous. Soviet commanders, forbidden to organize defenses in depth, watched helplessly as German panzers simply drove around their fortified positions and raced into the rear. Within 48 hours, entire Soviet armies were encircled, cut off from supplies and reinforcements. The scale of the early victories defied belief. By June 28, 6 days into the campaign, Army Group Center had advanced 280 miles. Minsk fell. The pocket west of the city trapped 300,000 Soviet soldiers. By mid-July, the Germans had captured Smolensk, 2/3 of the way to Moscow. Another enormous encirclement. German staff officers began to believe their own propaganda. The Red Army was collapsing, victory was weeks away. But something was wrong. The Soviets kept fighting. Surrounded units didn't surrender en masse, they fought until they were obliterated. New armies kept appearing. German intelligence had estimated 200 Soviet divisions. By August, they had identified over 360. Where were they coming from? The truth was simple and terrifying. The Soviet Union was vast beyond German comprehension, and Stalin had mobilized reserves the Wehrmacht didn't know existed. Factories in the Urals, beyond the reach of German bombers, churned out tanks and artillery. The Trans-Siberian Railway brought fresh divisions from the Far East. And the Soviet command, despite staggering losses, refused to consider surrender. General Georgy Zhukov was emerging as Stalin's most capable commander, a brutal, uncompromising officer who understood that Soviet advantages lay in mass and willingness to accept casualties. At Yelnya in late August, Zhukov organized the first successful Soviet counteroffensive of the war, pushing the Germans back from a strategic salient. It was a small victory, tactically insignificant, but psychologically crucial. The Wehrmacht could be stopped. Hitler and his generals began to argue. The original plan called for Army Group Center to drive straight to Moscow. Moscow was the political heart of the Soviet Union, the transportation hub, the symbol of communist power. Take Moscow, conventional military wisdom said, and the enemy loses the will to fight. But Hitler looked at the map differently. Ukraine's grain and coal beckoned in the south. Leningrad, the cradle of Bolshevism, needed to be erased in the north. In late July, against the vehement objections of his field commanders, Hitler ordered Army Group Center to halt its advance on Moscow. The panzer divisions that had been poised to strike the Soviet capital were instead diverted north and south to support the flanking army groups. General Heinz Guderian, Germany's premier panzer commander, argued furiously against the decision. He was overruled. On August 23, his panzer group turned south toward Ukraine. The decision would haunt Hitler for the rest of his life, but in the short term it paid immediate dividends. In the south, German forces converged on Kiev in a massive pincer movement. The Soviet Southwestern Front, commanded by General Mikhail Kirponos, was trapped in the largest encirclement battle in history. Over 650,000 Soviet soldiers were captured. Kiev fell on September 19. Ukraine, the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, was in German hands. The industrial city of Kharkov was seized. The path to the Caucasus oil fields seemed open. Stalin had refused to authorize withdrawal from Kiev despite the obvious danger, another of his catastrophic decisions that cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Kirponos died trying to break out of the pocket. In the north, Leningrad was surrounded by September, besieged but not captured. The Wehrmacht settled in for a starvation siege that would eventually kill over 1 million civilians. German artillery pounded the city daily. Supply routes were cut. The only lifeline was across Lake Ladega, a precarious ice road in winter that brought minimal supplies. Leningraders ate sawdust bread, boiled leather, resorted to cannibalism. But the city did not surrender. Moscow, the prize that might have fallen in August, remained unconquered. When Hitler finally reversed his decision in early September and ordered Army Group Center to resume the offensive toward the capital, 6 precious weeks had been lost. The autumn Rasputitsa was coming, the season of mud, when Russia's primitive roads dissolved into impassable swamps. And behind that, something far worse: winter. On September 30th, the final push toward Moscow began. Operation Typhoon, it was called. Army Group Center, reinforced to 1.9 million men, 1,700 tanks, and 14,000 guns, lunged forward in one last attempt to decapitate the Soviet Union before the weather turned. The opening moves were spectacular. At Vyazma and Bryansk, another 650,000 Soviet soldiers were encircled. German panzers punched through crumbling Soviet defenses. The road to Moscow seemed open at last. German reconnaissance units pushed to within sight of the Kremlin spires. Stalin ordered the government to evacuate to Kuibyshev, 800 miles to the east. Panic rippled through Moscow. Civilians clogged the roads fleeing eastward. NKVD troops blocked the exits, shooting looters and deserters. For a few desperate days in mid-October, it seemed the Soviet capital might fall without a fight. But the Red Army did not break. Stalin, for all his paranoia and murderous incompetence, made one crucial decision correctly. He recalled Zhukov from Leningrad and gave him command of Moscow's defense. Zhukov was a butcher, willing to spend lives without hesitation, but he was also a tactician who understood defensive warfare. Fresh Siberian divisions, equipped with winter gear and experienced in cold weather combat, arrived by rail and deployed west of the city. These were not the demoralized, poorly led units that had been slaughtered in the summer. These were veteran troops, many pulled from the Far East after Soviet intelligence confirmed that Japan would not attack Siberia. The Germans, meanwhile, were disintegrating. Not from enemy action, from exhaustion, supply failure, and the weather. The autumn mud came first. Tanks bogged down. Supply trucks couldn't move. Horses, yes, horses, the Wehrmacht was far less mechanized than propaganda suggested, died by the thousands, unable to haul wagons through the swamps. Ammunition ran short. Food supplies dwindled. And then, in early November, the first snow fell. The mud froze solid, which briefly helped mobility, but the temperature kept dropping. -10 degrees Celsius. -20. -30. German soldiers were still wearing summer uniforms. The quartermaster general had planned to supply winter clothing in October, but the trains were stuck hundreds of miles to the rear, blocked by partisan attacks and infrastructure collapse. Trainloads of winter coats sat in warehouses in Poland while men froze to death outside Moscow. Frostbite casualties exceeded combat casualties. Weapons froze. Machine guns jammed. Tank engines wouldn't start. Crews had to light fires under the engine blocks just to get enough heat for ignition. Men burned precious fuel just to keep warm enough to survive the night. Medical units were overwhelmed with frostbite cases, blackened fingers, toes that snapped off when boots were removed. Officers reported that their units were combat ineffective, not from enemy action but from the cold. Hitler, receiving these reports in his headquarters in East Prussia, refused to accept reality. The attack would continue. On December 2nd, a forward unit of the 258th Infantry Division reached the suburb of Khimki, just 12 miles from the Kremlin. Reconnaissance troops could see the spires of central Moscow through their binoculars. They photographed the view as proof they'd gotten that close. They got no farther. That same day, the temperature hit -35 degrees Celsius. And the next morning, December 5th, the thermometer read -40. Men urinated blood. Exposed skin froze in minutes. Vehicles wouldn't start no matter what the crews tried. And then, on December 6th, the Red Army counterattacked. Zhukov had been hoarding reserves, fresh divisions, winter-equipped, trained for exactly this kind of warfare. They struck along the entire front surrounding Moscow. Not a localized counterstroke, a massive, coordinated offensive designed to hurl the Wehrmacht back from the capital. Soviet ski troops infiltrated German positions at night. Siberian infantry, dressed in white winter camouflage, attacked from the forests. T-34 tanks, their wide tracks distributing weight across the snow, rolled forward while German panzers sat immobilized, frozen in place. The Germans, strung out, frozen, exhausted, reeled backward. Units that had fought continuously since June simply disintegrated. Men abandoned positions, fleeing westward in panic. Equipment was left behind: tanks, artillery, trucks, mountains of supplies. Field Marshal von Bock reported to Hitler that his army group was on the verge of collapse. Officers requested permission to retreat to defensible positions farther west, to shorten supply lines and regroup. Hitler refused. On December 16th, he issued a stand-fast order: no retreats, no matter the cost. Units would hold their ground or die in place. The order was militarily insane but psychologically crucial. The German army, which had never experienced a major defeat, was on the brink of panic. Retreat could easily turn into rout. and rout into total collapse. Hitler's order, brutal as it was, prevented that. But it couldn't change the fundamental reality. Operation Barbarossa had failed. The Wehrmacht had come within 12 miles of the Kremlin and could advance no farther. The Blitzkrieg, the lightning war that had conquered Europe, had been stopped cold in the frozen forests outside Moscow. Von Bock was relieved of command, officially for health reasons. Guderian was dismissed for requesting permission to withdraw. Brauchitsch, the army's commander-in-chief, was sacked. Hitler personally assumed direct command of the army, a decision that would have catastrophic consequences for Germany over the next 3 years. Let's step back and understand what just happened. In 6 months, the Wehrmacht had advanced over 600 miles into Soviet territory. It had killed or captured over 3 million Red Army soldiers. It had seized an area containing 40% of the Soviet population and much of its industrial base. It had destroyed over 20,000 Soviet tanks and 21,000 aircraft. By any conventional measure, this was the most successful military offensive in history. And yet the Soviet Union had not surrendered. Not even close. Stalin's regime, far from collapsing, had evacuated over 1,500 factories eastward, relocating entire industrial cities beyond the Ural Mountains. Workers dismantled machinery, loaded it onto trains, moved it 1,000 miles east, and reassembled it in makeshift buildings. Tank production, which had nearly ceased in the summer, was ramping back up. The Red Army, despite catastrophic losses, was fielding more divisions in December than it had in June. How? The numbers are staggering. The Soviet Union mobilized over 29 million people into military service during the war, more than Germany's entire adult male population. Its industrial capacity, once the factories were relocated and retooled, exceeded Germany's. And its geography, the sheer vastness of Russia, swallowed armies whole. German supply lines now stretched over 1,000 miles. Every mile weakened the Wehrmacht's offensive power. The Blitzkrieg, predicated on rapid movement and quick victory, had dissolved into a grinding war of attrition against an enemy with effectively infinite reserves. Hitler had gambled everything on a quick victory. He lost. But the war was far from over. In fact, the worst was yet to come. Because while the Germans had failed to destroy the Soviet Union, they still occupied vast swathes of its territory. And Stalin was determined to take it all back, no matter the cost in blood. Winter 1941-42 was catastrophic for the Wehrmacht. The cold alone caused over 250,000 frostbite casualties. Entire divisions were combat ineffective, huddled in makeshift shelters, burning furniture to stay alive. Villages were torched just to provide temporary warmth. Civilians were driven from their homes into the snow to make room for troops. The Soviets, by contrast, were in their element. Siberian divisions, many recruited from regions where winter temperatures routinely hit -40, pressed the offensive throughout December and January. They liberated hundreds of towns and villages. They pushed the Germans back from Moscow by 60 to 150 miles depending on the sector. Soviet cavalry units, highly mobile in snow conditions, raided deep behind German lines, cutting supply routes and spreading panic. But they couldn't break the German line entirely. Hitler's stand-fast order, insane as it seemed, had worked just enough. The Wehrmacht bent but didn't shatter. German soldiers, even frozen and starving, remained formidable defenders. They held strongpoints, fortified villages, fought with desperate courage. As the winter offensive exhausted itself in February, the front stabilized. Both sides, battered and bleeding, dug in and waited for spring. The Germans had learned a hard lesson. Russia could not be conquered in a single campaign. But Hitler, ever the gambler, was already planning the next offensive. He couldn't attack on all fronts. The Wehrmacht lacked the strength for that. So he chose to focus on the south, on capturing the oil fields of the Caucasus. Without oil, Hitler knew, Germany's war machine would grind to a halt. Romanian oil from Ploesti wasn't enough. Germany needed the Soviet oil fields at Baku, Grozny, Maykop. The summer of 1942 brought Operation Blue, a massive offensive through southern Russia aimed at cutting the Volga River and driving into the Caucasus Mountains. The offensive opened on June 28, 1942. German panzer divisions smashed through Soviet defenses and raced eastward across the open steppe. It looked like 1941 all over again. Soviet units retreated in disorder. Rostov fell, opening the gateway to the Caucasus. German troops advanced into the mountains, planting Nazi flags on the summit of Mount Elbrus, Europe's highest peak. In the north, other German forces drove toward the Volga River and the city of Stalingrad. Originally, Stalingrad was a secondary objective, a manufacturing center to be neutralized, nothing more. But as German troops approached the city, Hitler became obsessed with capturing it. Partly for its industrial value, Stalingrad produced tanks, weapons, and ammunition. Partly for its strategic location on the Volga, the major supply artery running north-south through western Russia. But mostly because it bore Stalin's name. Taking Stalingrad, Hitler believed, would be a devastating psychological blow to Soviet morale. Stalin, in turn, became equally obsessed with holding it. The city's name was his, its fall would be personal humiliation. He issued Order 227, not one step back. Retreat without authorization meant execution. Stalingrad would be defended to the last man. General Friedrich Paulus and his 6th Army were ordered to seize the city at all costs. They nearly did. In August, the Luftwaffe firebombed Stalingrad in one of the most destructive air raids of the war, turning much of it into rubble. Wooden buildings burned. Oil storage tanks exploded, pouring burning petroleum into the Volga. The city became an inferno. 40,000 civilians died in the first week of bombing. German infantry fought their way into the city in early September, battling block by block, building by building, room by room. The Soviets, commanded by General Vasily Chukov, defended with suicidal determination. Chukov's strategy was simple: hug the Germans so closely that their air and artillery superiority became useless. Soviet positions were sometimes only 50 meters from German lines. Any German bombardment would hit their own troops. The fighting devolved into the most brutal urban combat of the war. German tanks, designed for open country warfare, were nearly useless in the bombed-out urban wasteland. They couldn't maneuver in the rubble-choked streets. Soviet anti-tank teams ambushed them from basements and sewers. Buildings changed hands multiple times in a single day. Snipers picked off officers from hundreds of meters away. Vasily Zaitsev, a Soviet sniper, became legendary for killing over 200 German soldiers in the ruins of Stalingrad. Soviet reinforcements ferried across the Volga River at night, replacing casualties as fast as they fell. The crossing was a nightmare. German artillery pounded the river, sinking boats, killing men in the water. But the reinforcements kept coming. Entire rifle divisions were fed into the city, chewed up in days of fighting, and replaced with new ones. The average life expectancy of a newly arrived Soviet soldier in Stalingrad was less than 24 hours. But they kept coming. And the Germans kept pushing, pouring more troops into the inferno, obsessed with completing the capture. Fighting focused on key buildings and landmarks. The grain elevator became a fortress, held by a few dozen Soviet troops who fought for 5 days against overwhelming German attacks. The Red October factory, still producing tanks even as fighting raged through its workshops, was contested meter by meter. Mamayev Kurgan, a hill overlooking the city, changed hands repeatedly. Its slopes were so saturated with metal fragments from explosions that compasses didn't work. By November, the 6th Army controlled roughly 90% of Stalingrad. But that last 10%, a narrow strip along the Volga, remained in Soviet hands. Chukov's 62nd Army, reduced to a few thousand battered survivors, clung to the riverbank. German troops could see the Volga. They were so close. One more push, commanders told their exhausted men, just one more push and the city would fall. But that last push never came. Because while the world's attention focused on the brutal urban combat, Soviet commanders were preparing something else entirely. Zhukov and General Alexander Vasilevsky had spent months planning a massive counteroffensive, not in Stalingrad itself, but against the flanks of the German salient. The German army at Stalingrad was at the end of a long, narrow corridor stretching hundreds of miles west. To the north and south of the city, the German front was held not by elite Wehrmacht divisions but by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian troops, less well-equipped, less experienced, spread dangerously thin. Stalin's reserves had been carefully hoarded, hidden from German reconnaissance. Fresh armies were massed in secret, positioned to strike the weak flanks of the German position. On November 19, the hammer fell. Operation Uranus. Soviet forces punched through the Romanian lines north of Stalingrad with overwhelming force. Over 3,500 guns opened fire in a single massive bombardment. T-34 tanks rolled over Romanian positions. Within hours, the front had collapsed. Romanian units fled in panic. The next day, November 20, a second offensive struck from the south, again smashing through Romanian defenses. The two Soviet pincers raced toward each other, aiming to meet west of Stalingrad and trap the entire Sixth Army. German commanders at Stalingrad realized what was happening and urged Paulus to break out immediately while a corridor still existed. Paulus hesitated. He needed authorization from Hitler. On November 23, the two Soviet pincers met at Kalach, 60 miles west of the city. The entire Sixth Army, over 250,000 men, was encircled. The trap had snapped shut. Paulus radioed for permission to break out. Hitler refused. The Sixth Army would stand fast and await relief. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, promised to supply the pocket by air. It was a fantasy. Stalingrad required 500 tons of supplies per day just to maintain basic combat capability. The Luftwaffe, flying through winter storms and Soviet fighter screens, never delivered more than 120 tons on any single day. Most days, far less. Transport planes were shot down by Soviet fighters or anti-aircraft fire. Junkers Ju-52 transports, slow and vulnerable, became flying coffins. Pilots who survived multiple missions to the pocket described it as suicide duty. The men trapped in Stalingrad began to starve. Rations were cut, then cut again. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Then dogs. Then rats. Wounded men lay in the snow because there was no room in the aid stations and no medicine to treat them anyway. Frostbite returned as temperatures dropped. Men's faces turned black from gangrene. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, perhaps Germany's most capable commander, was given command of a hastily assembled relief force. In mid-December, he launched Operation Winter Storm, driving towards Stalingrad from the southwest. His panzers punched through Soviet defenses and advanced to within 30 miles of the pocket. For a few days, breakout seemed possible. Manstein urged Paulus to attack westward to meet him. But Hitler still refused to authorize a breakout, and Paulus, obedient to his Führer, stayed put. The Soviets, meanwhile, launched new offensives against other sectors of the front, threatening to encircle Manstein's relief force. He was forced to withdraw to avoid being trapped himself. The Sixth Army's last hope died. From then on, it was just a matter of time. The pocket was shrinking. Soviet artillery pounded the Germans relentlessly. Ammunition ran out. Food ran out. Medical supplies ran out. Wounded men froze to death in the snow because there was no fuel to heat the aid stations. By January, the Germans were trapped in the ruins of the city they had fought so hard to capture. Paulus requested permission to surrender. Hitler refused, promoting Paulus to field marshal. No German field marshal had ever surrendered, the implication was clear. Paulus was expected to fight to the death or commit suicide. On January 31, 1943, Paulus surrendered anyway. Over 90,000 German and Axis soldiers went into Soviet captivity. They were marched eastward into prison camps in Siberia. Most would never return. Of the 90,000 men captured, only about 5,000 ever saw Germany again. Stalingrad was the turning point. Not because of the numbers. The Soviets had lost encirclement battles just as large in 1941. But because this time it was the Germans who were trapped, starved, and annihilated. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility died in the rubble along the Volga. German newsreels, which had trumpeted victory after victory for 2 years, went silent. For 3 days, German radio played only funeral music. The German people were told their army had fought heroically but been overwhelmed. They were not told that Hitler's obsession had doomed an entire field army. After Stalingrad, Germany would win tactical victories, inflict terrible casualties, fight with skill and desperation. But it would never again mount a successful strategic offensive in the East. The Red Army, bloodied but unbroken, began the long, brutal march westward toward Berlin. Let's talk about why Operation Barbarossa failed, because the reasons matter far beyond this single campaign. First, logistics. The German war machine was designed for short, decisive campaigns. France fell in 6 weeks. Poland in a month. Yugoslavia and Greece in a matter of weeks. But Russia was different, not just bigger, but fundamentally resistant to blitzkrieg. The Soviet rail system used a different gauge than European railways, meaning German trains couldn't run on captured tracks without time-consuming modifications. Engineers had to physically rebuild hundreds of miles of rail line, converting Russian broad-gauge tracks to European standard gauge, while the war raged around them. German trucks, pushed far beyond their design limits on primitive roads, broke down by the thousands. By December 1941, over 30% of the Wehrmacht's vehicles were inoperable. There were no spare parts, no mechanics, no time for proper maintenance. Horses, the Germans used over 750,000 horses in Barbarossa, died en masse from exhaustion and cold. The Wehrmacht was far less mechanized than propaganda suggested. Most artillery was horse-drawn. Most supplies were moved by horse-drawn wagons. When the horses died, logistics collapsed. Supply lines that worked fine for a 300-mile advance into France collapsed utterly over 1,000 miles of Russian steppe and forest. Second, intelligence failure. German planners fundamentally underestimated Soviet strength and resilience. They knew Stalin had purged the Red Army's officer corps in the late 1930s, executing or imprisoning thousands of experienced commanders on fabricated treason charges. And they assumed this left the military crippled. They were half right. Soviet performance in 1941 was often appalling, marked by incompetent leadership and suicidal orders. Divisions attacked without reconnaissance, walked into ambushes, were encircled because commanders didn't understand basic tactics. But German intelligence missed the other half, the Soviet Union's ability to absorb losses and keep fighting. When the Germans identified twice as many Soviet divisions as expected, they didn't recalibrate their strategy. They just kept attacking, assuming the next battle would be the last. They never understood that the Soviet Union could mobilize manpower and industrial capacity on a scale Germany couldn't match. Third, weather and terrain. Yes, everyone talks about the Russian winter, and with good reason. But the autumn mud was just as devastating. German mobility, the core of their tactical doctrine, depended on trafficable roads. When those roads turned to soup in October, entire panzer divisions sat immobilized while the Soviets rushed reinforcements westward by rail. And when winter came, German equipment simply wasn't designed for it. Soviet T-34 tanks had wide tracks that distributed weight across snow and mud. German tanks, designed for European roads, sank. Soviet soldiers wore quilted winter uniforms, felt boots, for hats. Germans froze in their standard-issue uniforms. Diesel fuel gelled in German trucks at -20 degrees. Soviet trucks, designed for Siberian conditions, kept running. Even weapons failed. German machine guns, designed to tight tolerances, jammed in freezing temperatures. Soviet weapons, built with looser tolerances, kept firing. Fourth, Hitler's interference. The diversion of Army Group Center's panzers in August 1941 might have cost Germany the war. Generals like Guderian and Bock believed Moscow was the decisive objective. Take the capital, destroy the Red Army's command structure, sever the transportation hub connecting the entire Western Soviet Union. Hitler overruled them, chasing economic targets in Ukraine and symbolic victories in Leningrad. By the time the drive on Moscow resumed, the window had closed. This pattern, Hitler imposing strategic decisions over military advice, would repeat throughout the war, most catastrophically at Stalingrad. Professional officers understood that the Sixth Army needed to break out in November 1942. Hitler's refusal to authorize withdrawal doomed them. Fifth, and perhaps most important, ideological war. Operation Barbarossa wasn't just a military campaign. It was a war of annihilation rooted in Nazi racial ideology. German orders explicitly called for the liquidation of Soviet commissars, the starvation of millions of civilians, the enslavement of the Slavic population. The Hunger Plan, developed by Nazi economists before the invasion, deliberately planned to starve 30 million Soviet citizens to death to free up food for Germany. The Wehrmacht, complicit in these atrocities, created conditions that turned the Soviet population into partisan fighters. German supply lines were constantly attacked by guerrillas. Intelligence was compromised. Collaboration, which might have undermined Stalin's regime, and there were millions of Soviets who hated Stalin, became impossible when the alternative to communist rule was extermination. The Germans fought not just the Red Army but an entire people determined to resist occupation at any cost. Stalingrad's aftermath reshaped the entire strategic picture. With the Sixth Army destroyed, the Southern Front collapsed. The Germans had to evacuate the Caucasus to avoid encirclement. All those oil fields they'd fought so hard to reach were abandoned. By February 1943, Soviet forces had advanced hundreds of miles, liberating Kharkov and threatening to cut off army groups south entirely. Field Marshal Manstein, perhaps Germany's most brilliant operational commander, orchestrated a desperate counterattack in March that recaptured Kharkov and temporarily stabilized the front. It was a tactical masterpiece, a mobile defense that lured Soviet armies forward, then struck their flanks with concentrated panzer forces. But it was a tactical success in the context of strategic disaster. Germany was now fighting a defensive war in the east, and defensive wars are wars of attrition. Attrition favors the side with more men, more resources, more industrial capacity. That was not Germany. The summer of 1943 brought one last German offensive, Operation Citadel, an attempt to encircle Soviet forces in the Kursk salient. A massive bulge in the front line, Kursk seemed vulnerable to a pincer attack from north and south. Hitler delayed the offensive for months, waiting for new Panther and Tiger tanks to arrive. The delay gave the Soviets time to prepare. They fortified the salient with 8 successive defense lines, minefields, anti-tank ditches, concealed artillery. They knew the attack was coming. Soviet intelligence had penetrated German planning at the highest levels. When the offensive finally launched on July 5, 1943, it ran straight into a wall. The Battle of Kursk became the largest tank battle in history, involving over 6,000 armored vehicles. And it was a catastrophic failure. German panzers bled themselves white attacking prepared positions. Soviet anti-tank guns, concealed in the defenses, destroyed hundreds of tanks. At Prokhorovka, over 800 tanks clashed in a single massive engagement. The battlefield became a graveyard of burning steel. After 2 weeks, Hitler called off the offensive. The Wehrmacht had suffered 200,000 casualties and lost over 500 tanks. It had gained nothing. Germany would never again attack on this scale in the east. From Kursk onward, it was retreat, fighting delaying actions, trading space for time. The Red Army rolled westward like a tidal wave. Kharkov fell again in August 1943, this time permanently. Kiev was liberated in November 1943 after brutal street fighting. By early 1944, Soviet forces had pushed the Germans back into Poland and the Baltic states. The siege of Leningrad, which had lasted 872 days and killed over 1 million people through starvation, cold, and bombardment, was finally broken in January 1944. The road to the city was reopened. Supplies flowed in. Survivors, skeletal and traumatized, began to rebuild. In the south, the Red Army advanced into Romania and Bulgaria. German allies began switching sides or collapsing entirely. Romania switched sides in August 1944, turning its army against the Germans. Finland signed an armistice and withdrew from the war. Hungary tried to switch sides but was occupied by German troops. In June 1944, as the Western Allies landed in Normandy, Stalin launched Operation Bagration, a massive offensive through Belarus timed to coincide with D-Day. It was the Soviet equivalent of the Normandy invasion in scale and ambition. Over 2.3 million Soviet troops attacked along a 450-mile front, supported by 5,200 tanks and 5,300 aircraft. The offensive was named after a Russian general from the Napoleonic Wars, a deliberate parallel to Russia's defeat of Napoleon's invasion. The Red Army smashed through German defenses using tactics perfected over 3 years of warfare. Massive artillery barrages, coordinated tank and infantry assaults, deep penetrations by mobile forces that encircled German strongpoints. Army Group Center was destroyed. In 5 weeks of fighting, the Germans lost 450,000 men, killed, captured, or missing. It was the single most devastating defeat the Wehrmacht ever suffered, larger even than Stalingrad. Belarus was liberated. Soviet forces advanced 400 miles westward, reaching the gates of Warsaw. By the end of 1944, Soviet forces were fighting on German soil in East Prussia. Let's talk numbers, because the scale of the Eastern Front defies comprehension. Over 4 years of warfare, the Soviet Union suffered approximately 27 million deaths, military and civilian combined. Some estimates go even higher. Around 11 million Soviet soldiers died in combat or captivity. Another 16 million civilians died from starvation, disease, massacres, forced labor, and bombing. Entire cities were obliterated. Leningrad lost a quarter of its population. Minsk was almost completely destroyed. Kiev, Kharkov, Smolensk, rubble. Villages across Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia were burned to the ground, their inhabitants murdered. Germany and its allies lost over 5 million soldiers on the Eastern Front alone, about 80% of all German military deaths in World War II. The Wehrmacht committed 80% of its ground forces to the Eastern Front. The war against the Soviet Union consumed the German military entirely. The brutality was beyond anything seen in Western Europe. German forces massacred civilians systematically. Einsatzgruppen death squads followed the advancing army, executing Jews, communists, and anyone deemed racially undesirable. Over 1.5 million Jews were shot and buried in mass graves before the Germans even built the extermination camps. Soviet prisoners of war died by the millions in German captivity, deliberately starved, worked to death, shot. Of the 5.7 million Soviet POWs captured by Germany, over 3 million died. The Soviets, advancing westward, committed their own atrocities. German civilians fleeing the advancing Red Army were killed, raped, or deported. East Prussia was emptied of its German population. Villages that had existed for centuries were erased. And here's the bitter irony that defines this entire campaign. Hitler launched Barbarossa believing the Soviet Union was weak, that the Russian people would welcome liberation from communism, that one sharp blow would shatter the entire edifice. He was wrong on every count. The Soviet regime, brutal and paranoid as it was, commanded loyalty born from nationalism and fear of Nazi occupation. The German invasion unified Soviet society in a way Stalin's terror never could. Workers who'd been purged or oppressed threw themselves into defense production. Peasants who'd suffered through collectivization and famine fought as partisans. The Red Army, led by commanders like Zhukov who learned from early disasters, became an increasingly competent fighting force. And the Soviet industrial base, relocated beyond the Urals, outproduced Germany despite losing so much territory. By 1944, Soviet factories were building over 2,000 tanks per month, more than Germany's total annual production. The final act came in 1945. In January, the Red Army launched the Vistula-Oder offensive, advancing from Warsaw to within 40 miles of Berlin in just 3 weeks. German resistance, fanatical in places, was ultimately futile. Volkssturm units, old men and teenage boys pressed into service, were thrown against Soviet tanks. They died in their thousands, achieving nothing. In April, Soviet forces encircled Berlin with over 2.5 million troops. The assault on the city was apocalyptic. Soviet artillery fired 1.8 million shells into Berlin in the opening bombardment. The city burned. German defenders, Wehrmacht remnants, SS fanatics, Volkssturm, fought from the rubble. Hitler, hiding in his bunker beneath the chancellery, continued to issue orders to armies that no longer existed. He ranted about betrayal, about victory being snatched away by cowardice. On April 30th, as Soviet troops fought through the streets above, closing in on the government quarter, Hitler committed suicide. He shot himself in the head while simultaneously biting down on a cyanide capsule. His body was burned in a shell crater by his aides. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945. The war in Europe was over. Operation Barbarossa was the pivotal campaign of World War II. It failed in its objective to destroy the Soviet Union, and that failure doomed Nazi Germany. Once the Blitzkrieg stalled in the snow outside Moscow, once the Sixth Army surrendered at Stalingrad, once the offensive at Kursk was defeated, the outcome was mathematically inevitable. Germany could not win a long war against an enemy with superior resources and manpower. The Eastern Front consumed the Wehrmacht, division by division, year by year, until nothing remained but exhausted remnants defending a burning capital. Of the 13.6 million Germans who served on the Eastern Front, 10 million became casualties, killed, wounded, captured, or missing. The Wehrmacht was bled white in Russia. But let's be clear about something. The defeat of Nazi Germany was not inevitable in June 1941. If Hitler had concentrated on Moscow instead of diverting forces to Kiev, if the autumn mud had come 3 weeks later, if the Soviets had collapsed after losing another million men in encirclement battles, history might have turned differently. The margin between catastrophic Soviet defeat and German failure was thinner than we'd like to believe. What tipped the balance was Soviet resilience, the willingness to absorb unimaginable casualties and keep fighting, combined with German overreach and logistical collapse. The Soviet Union had depth, resources, population, industrial capacity. Germany had skill, courage, tactical superiority, but ultimately insufficient strength to conquer a continent. Here's what you need to understand. Barbarossa wasn't lost because German soldiers weren't brave or skilled. They were devastatingly so. German tactical performance throughout the war remained superior on a man-for-man, unit-for-unit basis. It wasn't lost because of a single tactical mistake. It was lost because the entire strategic premise was flawed. You cannot conquer a continent-sized nation with a military designed for 6-week campaigns. You cannot subjugate a population while simultaneously trying to exterminate it. You cannot fight a war of annihilation without becoming consumed by it yourself. Hitler's war in the East was doomed from the moment it began, not because of Russian winter or T-34 tanks or brilliant Soviet generalship, but because the objective itself was impossible. The Soviet Union was too large, too resilient, too willing to sacrifice everything to survive. Germany discovered, far too late, that it had invaded not a country but a force of nature. The legacy of Barbarossa extends far beyond military history. It shaped the post-war world in fundamental ways. The Soviet Union's suffering and victory gave Stalin the moral and strategic capital to dominate Eastern Europe for 45 years. At Yalta and Potsdam, the conferences where the Allies divided the post-war world, Stalin negotiated from a position of strength. His armies occupied Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Eastern Germany. He wasn't going to give that up. The Cold War's division of Europe, the Iron Curtain that split the continent for half a century, was forged in the battles between Moscow and Stalingrad. Eastern Europe's fate was decided not by diplomacy but by which army got there first. And the Red Army got there first because it had fought and bled across 1,000 miles to do so. The trauma of the Eastern Front scarred Russia's national psyche, creating a security paranoia that persists today. The Soviet Union lost 14% of its population in the war. There's hardly a Russian family that didn't lose someone. That generational trauma drives Russian strategic thinking even now. The fear of invasion from the West, the need for buffer zones, the willingness to accept authoritarian rule in exchange for security. Understanding Barbarossa is essential to understanding modern Russia. And the sheer scale of destruction, entire nations reduced to rubble, tens of millions dead, stands as history's warning about the cost of wars of annihilation. Hitler believed he could reshape the world through conquest. He reshaped it, certainly, but not in the way he imagined. The Thousand-Year Reich lasted 12 years. The Soviet Union, which he intended to erase from existence, emerged as a superpower that would rival the United States for half a century. And the German nation he claimed to serve was divided, occupied, and forced to confront the monstrous crimes committed in its name. The Eastern Front was where Nazi Germany died. Not in Normandy, not in the bombing campaign over German cities, but in the frozen forests outside Moscow, in the rubble of Stalingrad, in the tank battles at Kursk, in the retreat across Ukraine and Poland and back into Germany itself. The Wehrmacht lost 80% of its casualties fighting the Red Army. The Eastern Front was the war. Everything else, North Africa, Italy, D-Day, was secondary. This is not to diminish the Western Allies' contribution. American Lend-Lease aid provided crucial trucks, aircraft, food, and raw materials that kept the Soviet war effort running. British intelligence helped Soviet commanders anticipate German moves. The Allied bombing campaign forced Germany to divert resources to air defense. But the grinding, brutal arithmetic of the Eastern Front is undeniable. This is where the war was won and lost. If this story moved you, if it taught you something you didn't know, here's what I need. Hit that like button right now. Drop a comment below. Tell me what you think. Argue with my analysis. Share your own perspective on why Barbarossa failed or what the turning point really was. Subscribe if you want more history like this. Deep dives into the campaigns that shaped our world. No fluff, no filler, just the decisions and consequences that changed everything. Share this with someone who needs to understand that history isn't just dates and battles. It's the moment when 3.5 million men crossed a frontier believing they'd win a war in 6 weeks, and instead triggered a cataclysm that consumed nations and reshaped the world. That's history. That's what we do here. And there's so much more to tell. The Eastern Front lasted 4 years, and we've only scratched the surface. There are 100 more stories to explore. Leningrad Siege, the Partisan War, the tank battles, the individual soldiers who fought and died in conditions we can barely imagine. Stay with me, and we'll tell them all.